Hi there, thank you so much for clicking the thumbnail and being interested in my work. In this video I share with you this oil painting study of the Grisaille technique. So be sure to watch it right through till the end, because here and there I'll be slowing things down in real time so you can take a closer look. So let's dive in and take a look. Now for this study I'm using a canvas board I've made. It's flax canvas stuck onto MDF. Now there's a video in Patreon and also in YouTube explaining everything about this, how I prepare the boards, so if you want to check that out later. So what I've done is a freehand drawing here, but to save time I've gone straight to the outline rather than me showing you how I do the freehand. So I want to spend more time focusing on applying the paint. So let's dive in and take a look at that. Now I use Michael Harding paints, and I've got ivory black here and titanium white, and the medium I'm using is Liquid Original. Now the brushes I'm using, hog hair rounds, size number 4 3 of and number 2 3 of, and also synthetic rounds there. To separate the brushes in between your fingers so you don't get all the brushes covered in paint. So it's the easier way to do it. It keeps everything nice and clean. Mixing is quite straightforward. Just put plenty on there so don't starve your palette. And it's just a case of creating tones from dark to light, really. Basically that's all it is. You're creating a mid-tone, a dark and the white. I usually start with the lights first, so just picking out a few highlights here and there, the white of the eyes and the highlights on the forehead and cheeks. I generally then go for the sort of mid-tones and then try and get a few darks in there, and then focus on the darkest area, which will be the actual pupils of the eyes. So just focusing on that, so you're getting an extreme sort of value, and then you can work out in between then, so you've got something to actually compare to. Now a really important factor here is that I've primed it with a non-absorbent primer. Now this is from Michael Harding, and you only need a couple of coats, and it's amazing. It don't absorb, the paint doesn't absorb into the actual surface, so it keeps everything nice and fresh and you don't get dull colours then, and it makes it so you can move the paint around easier. So I'd check out that video I mentioned earlier. I'll just shine it up again so you can visually see it. Now the hog hair brushes are best brushes for this job, just putting the basic sort of structure in there, because they can scrub that tone in there as well. It makes it easier to move paint around. Because if you started using like those synthetic rounds or flats here, they'd sort of bend over and it won't be able to manipulate the paint. So the hog hair brushes are better, but what I'm tending to do here is trying to get the overall tones in there. So I'm blocking in, I'm not bothered about the detail at the moment, just sort of getting it all roughed in blocks of sort of tones. And once I've got all the paint in there, then I'll go smaller with the brushes, and then eventually smaller with the synthetic rounds, just to tighten the details up and just to make it more accurate. It's just like my pastel work, where the underdrawing is actually to correct the outline. So what I'm doing is correcting what I've drawn, because it's freehand, so I'm checking everything, making sure everything's alright, and then getting a basic feel. Now I'm opening my heart as well, I'm connecting to the energy of the subject. So the more you can open up, the more you can send this open heart feeling to the subject or the reference image. There's an energy that comes back from that, and you absorb that, and it goes through your body, out your hands, into your work. Just showing the palette in view now so you can see how I'm manipulating the paint and mixing it. Now it comes to a stage where everything gets a little bit thin and sticky, so you have to remix paint so you can make sure you've got plenty of pigment on your palette, because if it gets too thin it gets a little bit sort of unmanageable. It starts to get tacky too much and sticky, and you can't move things around. So make sure you've got plenty of paint on your palette always. If you're enjoying this video, why not subscribe? It's absolutely free, then you're sure not to miss any of my future videos. Here you can see me using the little hog hair brushes now, just to sort of tighten things up. I'm doing little circles, little sort of movements, and I'm mirroring what I'm seeing, so I'm letting the movements just happen. So I'm not thinking about it, I'm just sort of letting it just develop on its own. Now with the little synthetic rounds here, I'm just tidying everything up, just making sure that things are in the right place. It's all preparation then for when you start putting the colour on. The more accurate you can get here, the better it will be when you start putting the colour on. So it's worth taking your time to make sure everything's in the correct place. Now coming to the end of the first stage, now just leave this to dry now for 2 or 3 days before you start with the next colour stage. Now I've named all the colours on screen for you. We're starting off with the cadmium red, and then I'm going to use a mixture of yellow ochre and cadmium red together with white, just making sort of tints as we go down, and then yellow ochre. So you've got yellow ochre, then red, and then in between. And then it's burnt umber and red, and then ultramarine blue and brown for the greys. Now to desaturate the red, I'm using a green as complementary colour, so it creates nice sort of subtle greys, and then just tinting it with a white, because if you're wanting to desaturate a pink, you just put a light green with it. So let's just get a bit of colour down first. I'll start with little brushes to start with and just see what happens. So got a little bit of liquid here, look. So I'm going to work on the lighter area first then, so just get a bit of, see I can pick a bit of red from there, a little bit of yellow ochre from there, look, and make a slightly lighter colour than that. So you can play about and move it around. I'm just going to get some pigment down to start with around these lighter areas. It's a bit too light. Squint your eyes, it's more there. So I'm just sort of just putting some colour notes in to start with. Does change the colour when over this sort of different tones of grey though. It's amazing how different it is. You won't think it, but it is. Right, I'm just going to put a bit of brown and red in here to start with. I'm only putting translucent paint, you see, because you're using that grey underneath what you've already put in. I'm only going to do this section as well, as I mentioned, so I'm just laying some colour on. Like that, so you're just blocking it in. Dabbing it in like that. Interested in seeing this study completely like you've just heard, real-time audio, real-time video. It is on my Patreon in 3 parts, so if you wanted to check that out, the link is in the description below. Now the shadow here, I'm just mixing the green and the red together. I'm putting that over and just basically getting some areas here and there similar colour, getting a feel for the balance of where these tones and values are. So it's a case of just playing and just seeing what works, but using the same formula as what I do with my pastels really, using yellow ochre, warm red and desaturate with green. So initially I'm just blocking over the grey with colour, but just using a little bit of liquid, but more or less scrubbing it on there with the actual hog hair brushes. The hog hair brushes seem to be better than the sort of synthetic rounds, because you can scrub the colour in and you can apply more quickly with the hog hair brushes too. Now for the eyes I'm using ultramarine blue, yellow ochre and a touch of red in there to start with. And then what I did then is mix up a purple to create more of a purpley bluey colour. So using a bit of ultramarine Elysian crimson. Now using brown and blue for around the iris, and then inside the iris I'm using ultramarine blue with a bit of lemon yellow because it's got greeny eyes. And then just basically just glazing over with that brown and blue. Rather than using black, I mixed the black using brown and blue. Now I've used like a burnt sienna colour, so I've mixed it to make it look like a burnt sienna colour and just put that around the actual pupil because it gives it life, you see, creates that sort of feeling of depth to the pupil there. Now I'm slowing it down to real time now so you can actually see me putting these little marks in the eyes. Again, very thin paint using burnt umber and ultramarine blue and just feeling my way and just glazing here and there and then just putting them fine details over the top of that. Always take my time when I'm doing these sort of things and really open up your heart and connect to the soul of the person by just sensing what's behind these eyes and let that feeling come into you, let it flow through out of the hands into the actual painting, and really just sort of take your time and just mix in very, very thinly, just build it up slowly but surely. So after you've initially put down the colour on this grey, you'll notice it looks a bit wishy-washy, so you have to in places really put a little bit more pigment in there to create more of a chroma ready for the next stage, because you have to think when you glaze over the top of that it needs to be fresh enough underneath for it to feel right. So I've added more pigment now. Now this looks a little bit red on the cheek here, but I will subtle that up later. Just working on the ear, so I'm just sort of basically getting some pigment down again, but more richer in certain areas. Adding more shadowing now by again the green mix with the red, and then adding a little bit of white to tint it a little bit as well in places. So you have to keep sort of playing about, keep squinting your eyes and just getting a general feel for it. Now I'm using a dry brush now just to soften up those freckles and marks there, just to soften it up a bit before the next sort of coat. And then just putting a little bit of subtlety in there, just preparing it all now for the second coat of colour. Just putting the odd little bit of detail in here and there. If you're enjoying this video, why not give it a like and share it with your friends? It would mean so much to me, as this would help the channel to grow. When you're blending the colours, it's best to wipe your brush onto like a kitchen paper or something like that. Add a bit of pigment, wipe your brush, and then just blend in with it. Now this is the end of the first coat of colour, so I just need to leave that to dry now for 2 or 3 days. Right, so this is a start of the second layer plus the details. So I've laid the colour out exactly the same as I've done before, but not so much of it. So you can see there's not some bigger piles, and it's a case of laying it down thinly in places and thickly in other places. So the more brighter it is, the thicker the paint, and the more sort of shadowed it is, the thinner the paint really. So the more sort of pigment you've got in there, the more brighter it is. So basically what I'm doing here is starting off with the highlights, getting the highlights correct first. So I'm squinting the eyes and sort of getting overall balance. So I'm picking out these areas that are the lightest area. Now I'm not just pouring pure white in there, I'm mixing it either with yellow or a bit of red, and might be adding a little bit of lemon yellow with it as well, just to give it that sort of zinginess in places. Now I'm just moving the actual brush in little circles, little dots, just swizzles, just to create a little bit of texture and interest in these highlights. So now I'm going into the shadow area, so I'm going from one extreme to the other. So now I'm using the green and red mix, so if it needs to be a little bit warmer, I'm adding a bit of the yellow ochre with it. If it needs a bit more redder and cooler, I'm adding a bit of blue and red together to create purples. So there's all sorts of colours in these shadows. It's not just like a dark red, there's all sorts of subtleties. There is a close-up view of it now. I've slowed it down so you can actually see the actual different subtleties and colours in there. There's yellows, pinks, purples, greens. There's all sorts of different shades of skin tone in there, and it's really interesting just to sort of mix on your actual canvas. So I'm just picking up colours and just mixing them like I would if I were pastels, doing pastels, you know. So it's just a matter of just applying the same sort of rules really, and just blending them in. Just mix a colour, blend it in to the other colour, and just creating the right sort of temperature and subtlety really, by adding that yellow if it wants to be warmer, blue if it wants to be cooler, and desaturating with the green if it needs it. Just like to take this opportunity to thank all my Patreons for their wonderful support. Can't thank you enough, it means a lot to me. If you're interested in joining me on Patreon and would like the benefit of longer, slower and more in-depth videos, please check out the link in the description below for more details. I find it really important as well to get the shadows correct, because if the shadows are not dark enough, it'll just throw everything out. So really got to get those lights and the darks right, and then everything else just falls into place then. Now in the shadow areas it's very thin colour, I'm just scrubbing it in really. But there's all sorts of subtleties. There's the sort of blue, purples, reflected light, you see this is shining on there. It's creating all these like rainbow colours in the flesh tone. So here's a close-up view of it, and now I'm mixing it. So just more or less scrubbing it in really. Not much pigment and not much actual liquid as well. So it's more or less straight out at tube really, and just scrubbing it in to what you've already put in there, and just letting it sort of mix in. Now if you make a mistake like that, just rub it in, just dry your brush. What you don't see me do is I keep wiping my brush tip as well. So I put a bit of pigment down, dry my brush, then scrub it in. So I'm doing that constantly, putting a bit of paint down, and then if it's too thickly put on, I just wipe the paint off my tip of my brush and then just use that as a blending tool then. Just using the smaller brushes now to fine-tune things, preparing your way, because the last details that they're right at the end with these eyelashes here, I'll just put placement, but there will be more detail put into these at the later on in this video. So it's just preparation really there. With the hair, I've put in deeper sort of dark shadow in there using the brown and blue, and then just highlighting them with a mixture of yellow ochre, red and blue. So it's just a combination of all the three colours. Now for the details on the eyebrows there. So I'll scrub some colour in there first. It makes it easier then to actually use paint over the top, because if you try and put detail over dry paint, it tends to be a little bit hard work. So if you use like a scrubbed colour underneath, it acts as a vehicle then for when you start putting these fine details on. Now I'm using at the moment here a flat synthetic brush. It's good for getting those sort of loose sort of details in. I will be using a synthetic round for the finer details, but for just getting this sort of idea of the movement and the flow of the eyebrows, because you have to be careful not to put too much detail in. It's just a case of just seeing what's there and painting what's there and just letting it flow. And like everything else I do, I don't name it. I don't think, oh, I've got to do the eyebrows now. I know I'm naming it here because obviously I've got to communicate, but when I'm painting I just switch off all names and I just see what's there. So I see the highlights, the detail, and just paint what I see and just let it flow, rather than trying to get every hair the same. I'm just getting that feeling and movement of the eyebrows. Same thing with the eyelashes here, just mixing very, very thin paint, using brown and blue again, and just feeling my way. Keep wiping my brush as well, so if I don't want to get too much paint on there, so just make it so it's just enough. So it's just a case of just being aware of that. So very, very thin paint, hardly any on the brush at all. But they can add more to it as you go along, you see. Best to have a little amount to start with and then build it up. And then I'm just putting a few highlights in between those eyelashes there, and just, you know, putting that sort of little bit of sort of detail and finesse to it at the end. Now I tend to sort of step back a lot at these stages here and sort of take photograph of it with mobile phone, maybe look through the mirror over my shoulders and see what it looks like. So just sort of getting an overall sort of a fresh look at it. Just squinting your eyes to see the value, open your eyes to see the colour. And these little fine details do make a difference. Just add in those subtleties there, just highlight in the corner of the eye as well. There's always a little bit of redness to the flesh inside the corner of the eyes, and there's always a highlight there as well. So, but it's not pure white. I've added red to that, so it's a little bit pinky white. Thank you so much for watching the video right till the end, and if you want to see the full probably 6 or 7 hours of this real-time video, real-time audio, it is on my Patreon now in the oil painting section, so please check that out. The link is in the description below. And if you want to see more of my YouTube videos, please check out this link here. Take care, bye for now.